Yo yo yo,
Hey, how are you doing today?
doing good, doing good. I'm working at the moment. Like I just work at a little shop, so if I go silent, it's just because I got a customer.
Oh,
But I'll
okay,
still
but
be
but
listening.
it's not like too much for you to work in live because I know some people
No,
can't do
no.
that. Okay,
If it is, I will let you know and stuff, and we could just like continue later on.
all right, sounds good. Um, Real quick before we begin, how long have you been a Christian for?
Well, I claim to have been a Christian, since I was probably like a preteen. But it wasn't until like I was 3 years ago when I was 18, when I got saved and baptized, I felt like I could call myself a Christian.
All right, I got you. And are you like a part of any certain denomination? Or are you more like just open with it?
Um, I try to say that I'm Baptist. I did a little research a while ago on like where I feel like I should put myself in. I have some Methodist beliefs, but for the most part, I think I'm mainly Baptist.
For sure, I got you, no problem. And what are your thoughts about the biblical slavery topic?
So, I feel like I think it's a my thoughts on slavery in the Bible, I feel like are misinterpreted. Um, which I think there's some verses in Leviticus that make it seem like God condones slavery, and I've done a little research and further into it, I've realized that it is some misinterpretation of verses, and then also like the term slave. Also, I feel like wouldn't be applicable to how we see slavery as today.
Okay, I can get that. So let's just clarify real quick. When I'm talking about slavery, I'm talking about the act or practice of somebody owning another person as property. This can be done either legally or illegally. A modern example, I would say it's illegal, but sex trafficking. I would call that sex slavery, but that would fall under slavery. It is a person that is being taken and quote unquote owned and used as property and as an object. Um, and then if we're looking more at like a legal thing, we could talk about just like just a couple hundred years ago when black people were able to be slaves and stuff. Um, so that's what I'm talking about when I'm referring to slavery. It can show itself in many different ways, but the base practice is people owning people as property. Do you agree?
So in the sense of like comparing slavery in the Bible to I forgot what the word was. It sounds like cattle. There's like a terminology for the slave that
Chattel.
we chattel. There you go.
Hmm.
Chattel. I think the difference between like chattel slavery and the slavery that we see in the Bible is like night and day. As chattel slavery, they were given no rights, whereas in slavery back then you were given rights. If you were to be beaten by your slave owner, you were to be released from slavery. Um, and what else? All slaves were given the Sabbath day, so they were given a day off. So I more so look at it as not really slavery, but more of like a servitude. So I don't think that it would kind of be classified as slavery back then. But I do agree that what you said of owning people at the end of the day can be considered slavery, but I don't think like putting them in the same boat is the correct way to go about it.
So okay, so you don't agree that people owning people as property, that dehumanizing practice is equivalent to slavery, and then there are different categories of slavery. You don't agree with that?
Yes, because in the case of slavery in the Bible, that was people like selling themselves. It was also looked out as like beneficial for both parties, as obviously the slave owner is getting works done and the slaves are receiving, food, shelter, and other necessities, money. in some cases. So that's why I say like the term slave really shouldn't be called, that back then, because it really was like a job.
So there are okay, let me ask you, what is your definition for slavery? What is slavery?
Oh, I got a customer coming in, but
For sure.
my definition of slavery from top of my head is, holding somebody against their will, regardless of how they feel or if they want to leave or not. I'll be right back.
Sure. I mean, I would just call that kidnapping. Slavery is a little bit more of a different thing. It's a quote unquote role of life that you have enforced onto this individual and are not having them to have their freedom. Um, as far as like you know, people kidnap for all kinds of different reasons, and not all of them are for slavery. But we'll wait for him to come back, and then we'll dive into the Bible. I'm pretty sure also the Code of Hammurabi had it so that if you beat a slave unjustly, you face consequences. Let me double check with that. Hey, Grandpa Bucks, how you doing? Let's see. So yeah, even the Code of Hammurabi allowed slaves to accumulate wealth that could get them to buy their freedoms. Adoption, slaves were able to be adopted into the family, or slaves could even marry into the family. There were laws about beating them unjustly. So I don't see anything that the Hebrew if we're gonna say that the Hebrews didn't practice slavery because they did these things, then we have to say that none of them practiced slavery. I don't know. Let's get the Bible ready. All right, here we go.
Alrighty. So, the last I heard you saying that it was kidnapping. That you was
Yeah, I would from what you told me, I would describe that more as kidnapping. I think it's the reason why someone is kidnapped depends on whether we can call it slavery or not. For example, going somewhere else and taking people from their homeland to bring them back to be your slaves, I would call that kidnapping. But it's kidnapping for the purpose of putting them into slavery. Whereas some people, like we've had women that have kidnapped children just because they couldn't have children and wanted to be a mother. I wouldn't call that slavery. I would just call that kidnapping. Or people that are trying to, there's a whole different plethora of reasons why someone might kidnap individuals, which is taking someone and holding them against their will, not letting them leave. But I think slavery itself is something different. It's the practice of where you have taken that human being and have dehumanized and degraded them to the point where they are just an object to be of use to you. It is something for you to use. And I think that that's different than other reasons why people might kidnap other individuals. So that's why my clarification isn't quite on par with yours, but I'm trying to understand where you're coming from. And then the second thing that you said was, that you don't see it as slavery because they got paid and, things were provided for them. There were laws against beating them unjustly or too much or something like that. But if you even look up into the Code of Hammurabi, which is another ancient Near East law code that was not the Israelites, they also had laws where slaves could accumulate wealth, or that they could even marry in or be adopted into the family. And there were laws against mistreating them or abusing them unnecessarily or too harshly. There's a case of a woman who believed her slave was stealing, and so she had to actually go to the court to get permission to even just beat her slave at all, let alone to what degree. So if you're going to make the case that just because the slaves in the Bible received this stuff, therefore they can't be called slaves, then I think you would have to say that there is no slavery at all in the Bible from anyone's point of view, not even Egypt, because Egypt provided the Israelites with food, shelter, land, even, and gave them a whole place to go live and have their families. So, if you're going to take that approach, then I think you'd have to say that slavery itself just doesn't exist.
No, was that all you had?
Yeah,
Were
yeah,
you done?
yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, okay. Um, the reason why I wouldn't say slavery doesn't exist, but why I was saying like there was like levels to it, or maybe in the sense like there's two different forms of slaveries, and chattel slaves, they were kidnapped from local lands with promises of a better life, but were forced into slavery. However, in the Bible, the death penalty is for anyone who does that, which is in Exodus 21:16. Like anyone will be put to the death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. So kidnapping is completely against the law of God. And then also, how it's also different from chattel slavery is slavery was consensual. Somebody was a slave, they sold themselves into servitude. So that's why it's like, can we really compare someone that, was kidnapped from their land and made a slave? And can we compare that and say that that someone who sells themselves to escape poverty, is that still slavery in the sense? Like, would you classify those both as slavery? I feel like there's just
So,
two different ways to it.
so yeah, I understand how um, how you're saying that you're hesitant to call this chattel slavery because these are people through hard times and stuff like that sold themselves into a servitude role and had these type of legal protections. But I think the problem is that the Bible has, at least in its law code, two systems of quote unquote slavery. One is more what you're talking about, an indentured servitude kind of role, and the other one is actual chattel slavery, I would say. Because one of them has, and it's for free people, it's for who the law recognizes as people. So that's why it's saying you can't kidnap a free individual. It's when it's saying you can't kidnap someone and then go make them a slave. We're taking a free person and you are turning them into a slave, and that is what the law is saying not to do. But the problem here is that the Bible allows the indentured servitude, and you can see most of those rules in Exodus 21, which is when someone sells himself into a situation either to repay a debt, or they're in poverty, or they got resources from that person, whatever the deal was. They serve them for a certain amount of time, and after 6 years, they get to go free. There's a couple of asterisks to that, depending on if you're a male, female, have a family or not. But that's basically the gist. You go, you work off your time, and then you go back home. But when it comes to slavery, which you mentioned in Leviticus, we look at Leviticus 25:44 through 46, which is God's own words, saying, "But the slaves that you may have, you can buy them from the nations around you." So you're not kidnapping them, you're buying them. And you may also get them from the foreigners that live with you. And it is of them that you may make slaves, and they will be your property forever. And you can pass them on to your next generations after you. And it is of them that you may make slaves, but remember not to rule ruthlessly over your fellow Hebrew Israelites. And earlier in that chapter, it even distinguishes that the servants, the indentured servitude roles that you're talking about, to pay them because they are hired workers. Don't treat them like slaves, but the slaves that you can have. And then he tells them how they can obtain them. So God is very, very specific when He is talking about indentured servants, and that you do pay them and you treat them as hired workers, not as slaves. The people you can treat as slaves, and He goes on to explain who you can get as slaves. And then we do see examples like in Deuteronomy 20, where if Israel decides to be the aggressor in a war and just they can go up to any city, besiege it, and say, hey, be our slaves, or we're going to come kill all your men and then just take everyone else as slaves anyway. And that's kidnapping. That's going to someone else's land and kidnapping people and forcing them to be slaves. So even in the Bible, underneath this law that God is giving, we are seeing Him give His people permission to go and violate other people's freedoms and then make them from free people into slaves to serve them. And they are slaves forever, and they don't have the same protection against mistreatment as the Hebrew Israelites do at the very end of verse 46 in Leviticus 25.
So in Leviticus 25, 44 through 46 is, what you were saying points out that biblical slavery allows Israelites to keep foreigners as slaves for life, whereas Hebrew slaves were to be freed after 7 years, which is in Deuteronomy 15. But however, in context to this relates to the year of Jubilee, where the Hebrew slaves were allowed to return home. With someone with no homeland, that wouldn't be an option. So, and it says in Leviticus that the Israelites are supposed to treat foreigners the same they would as locals. So this idea that they're in slavery forever isn't actually what is being said. They were released and freed after 7 years. And let me see what point is proof.
In verse 46, it says that you may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. So, no, they did not go free. At least the non-Hebrew slaves, they did not go free, because it says right here, they will continue to be the possessions of the next generation, which doesn't mean 6 years you go free. It means you are, in this whole chapter of proclaiming freedom throughout the land, these people are still forever possessions. And why is that? Because they're slaves.
Well, and that in the case is because the Hebrews are allowed to return to their homelands, but someone that doesn't have a homeland wouldn't be able to return to. So obviously they would stay. But I think that's still releasing them of their of their bondage, if you would call it, just slavery. They would be released of their duties.
Can you show me a scripture that supports that?
Yes, which is like I said, Leviticus 19:33 to 34 commands the Israelites to treat foreigners as they would treat locals.
Yes, but again, remember, we're talking about free individuals. The law recognizes free individuals as people. When it's talking about slaves, the ones that doesn't recognize as people, it calls them possessions, which is what we just saw in Leviticus 25, 44 through 46. So, and I pointed out a little verse right before that in Leviticus 25. If you start in verse 39, it specifies God talking about who to pay and who you don't have to pay. And then it talks about who you cannot treat as slaves, and then we get to 44 through 46 of who you can have as slaves. It seems like it all makes perfect sense how God is explaining who you can in fact own as a slave forever. So when God says these people you can own as slaves forever, where are you getting, but they're free after 6 years?
I'm getting that from the because you had said that that's for people that are free, they're seen as people, but there are Hebrew slaves. So the Hebrew slaves would be classified the same as just a regular slave, someone that
They're
isn't
not,
Hebrew.
though.
And you said what verse supports that?
39. It said here. I'll read it to you in Leviticus 25, verse 39. It says, "If your brother, who's a Hebrew, becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He will be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner, and he shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee, and then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own clan and return to the possessions of his father. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but shall fear your God. And then it goes, but as for the slaves that you can have, this is where you can get them, and you may have them forever. So we see God very, very specifically saying, these are the people in these situations. If they sell themselves to you, they must go free. They must be a hired worker. They are not to be treated as a slave. And then he goes to, but the slaves you can have. This is where you can get them. This is who they can be, and you may have them and treat them as property forever. So he's
Okay.
very clear that this one group gets to go free and gets paid and gets treated well, but this other group, you can have them forever. They're legal possessions and property, even unto the next generation, and there's no rule against mistreatment for them like he did for the Hebrews.
Okay. I just got one customer real quick, and then I will respond to that.
Go for it. Take your time. Yeah, but even if this is God we're talking about, yeah, I get that. Sorry guys, our guest is at work, but you know what? I think it's a pretty good conversation so far. I like going through the text and seeing different things, you know. I also know that the year of Jubilee proclaims freedom and liberty throughout all the inhabitants of the land. But you know, inhabitants by definition also includes animal lives, and we know they didn't release their animals, and their slaves weren't seen as people. So yeah, well, but yeah, so we know that they didn't release their animals because I mean, how cool would that have been? But they didn't do that. But I think that God has been very clear in this legal code of how of these roles of servants and slaves, and He is showing how if these people end up in this situation, you must treat them this certain way. You got to pay them. You got to treat them well. You know, you can't sell them as a slave because they're my people. But then when it comes to not his people, it's like these are the ones that you can make slaves. These are the ones that you can not worry about how you treat, or at the very least, you know, it gives the rule for not ruling over Israel or God's people harshly in verse 43 and at the very end of verse 46. So he's very clear twice. The people of Israel, don't rule over them ruthlessly. But never once does he say this for their non-Hebrew slaves. And I think that that's a huge eye-opener, at least for me. But let's go Leviticus 19, because there was something that I also wanted to bring up in there.
Okay. So the reason why I feel like, the Hebrew slaves, and like why I am very adamant that that the Hebrew slaves are treated just like the regular slaves is because it says in Deuteronomy 23:15 through 16, you shall not hand over You shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst in the place which he shall choose in one of your towns where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him. So basically, if a slave ran away, he wasn't to be returned to his master. Rather, the family who he ran to is required to harbor him and treat him well and let him live where he chooses. And that would be applicable to not just Hebrew slaves, but to all slaves.
Sure. So it's my understanding in this is that if a slave ran away, that this would be and I've talked to biblical scholars on this as well, and I've asked this question, that this is the understanding of slaves that are running away from their masters to Israel. They're finding sanctuary in Israel, and that's why they are given this a lot of land or allowed to live with them and stuff like that. It's not a slave running away from another Israelite to go somewhere else. And I completely understand why other nations would be like, nah, we're not going to return your slaves. That's just not our thing, and we don't care. Especially when their whole theology and belief was it's literally them versus everyone else who's evil. That just makes sense to me. But I don't see how this in any way is... I'm sorry, is showing that slavery isn't... allowed in the Bible. It's just showing that if a slave runs away to Israel, that you treat them fairly. You don't make them a slave because they didn't make them the slaves. They just saw a foreigner come into their area. But I think that the big telling point is in Leviticus 25, where God is very specifically saying these people, treat them as hired workers, pay them and don't mistreat them. But these people, you can make slaves and you can keep them forever. And I'm not going to say anything about how you should treat them properly or not. So I can understand why you would want to say that they're supposed to be treated the same, but just because they're treated the same in one aspect, I don't see how that overshadows all these key main points of the way that they're clearly different in the other passage.
So I was about to respond. So yes, so like with the whole idea, the Bible forbids beating slaves, such as an eye or a tooth is lost, beating a slave, that slave is allowed to go free. Hold up one sec, got customers.
I know we only got like a couple people watching. Yeah, that was the response. What's that story where that Israelite guy went and gathered his runaway slaves? Because we see that. Again, that this is more supporting the scholarly consensus that this is about slaves running away to Israel. But slaves that ran away from Israel got hunted down. They were brought back. I want to say he was around King David's time. Let's see. I know it's in there. I'm gonna find it. Hold on.
Alrighty, I am back. So, where I was at, I was talking about Exodus 21, which is like says an owner who hits a male or a female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye, and an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. So obviously, this is God's way of basically to explain it is, God says you can't divorce anyone, but clearly people are still going to divorce. So that's why Jesus came and clarified and says if you divorce, it should only be because of sexual immortality. This is God realizing that, hey, slavery is in our culture. It's just going to happen. So these are the ways that he can try and make it better in the sense, but that doesn't mean that he's not going to abolish it later, and that doesn't mean that he approves of it. He's basically giving these rules to people that have slaves because slavery is just a normal thing in that culture at the time. And at the what is it? Slave owners would want to keep their slaves submissive, so they would give them an altered version of the Bible known as the Slave's Bible, which cut out a large portion of the Bible because it can entice slaves to be disobedient to their master. So if the Bible completely supported slavery, this wouldn't be necessary. So I really think that a lot of this is, just cherry picking certain verses when there's other verses that, fully explain like what God meant when he was explaining the rules of slavery. It wasn't him allowing it. It was him basically giving a rule set for the culture at the time, which Leviticus is Old Testament. So
Yes.
why, I mean, when Jesus came, he didn't abolish that, but we aren't called to live like the Old Testament times either. So clearly the New Testament has nothing to do to support, the verses in Leviticus anyways, because we live in a different time now.
All right. You said a lot. I'm sorry if I missed something. I'll try to address it. So I think it's very interesting that you bring up like cherry picking verses because you brought up a verse in Exodus 21 and somehow jumped to divorce. Do you know what the context of Exodus 21 is about?
The Exodus 21:26 about
No, just Exodus 21. Do you know what the context of this chapter is about?
remind me.
Okay, the context is God explaining the regulations and rules for to the Hebrews on things like indentured servitude, Hebrew to Hebrew relations, and Hebrew to free people relations within their own society. So we have the first chunk of verses is giving the understanding of indentured servitude. When this passage is talking about the slaves in their time, and talking about if you permanently disfigure someone basically, or hurt them horribly in a way that's permanent, that they go free. It is because you have gone against the contract of this indentured servitude. That's why they get to go free for the eye's sake. And because if they went with the law that states an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a burn for a burn, a life for a life, if they were in any way like just a regular free person, if they struck out that person's eye, that person doesn't get to go free. That person that did the eye striking out has to get their eye taken out too. But that's not what happened. Why? Because that person was underneath this contract protection of the master because of this indentured servitude, and because that was violated, they no longer had to pay the rest of their service. That was seen as null and void. That's not the same as being able to go to another place, kidnap people, and take them back to your land and make them your slave forever and legally see them as property forever. So it's not the same thing that we're talking about. In that the context for Exodus 21 is talking about an indentured servitude role, whereas in Leviticus 25:44 through 46, it's not talking about indentured servitude. It's talking about people being the property of other people forever. And then we see how they can be obtained through the Bible. Leviticus 25 tells us that's purchasing. Deuteronomy 20 and 21 show us that you can go and pick a place, make war with them, and make the survivors your slaves. So you can go to other places, take them from their homelands, and come back and do with them as you will. That's also slavery. And then, as the author of Ecclesiastes brags, he has so many slaves because his slaves are multiplying. So you can just be born into it. So there are at least three ways the Bible God allows his people to have slaves. And because people can be born into slavery and continue being a slave, we know that that is literally a forever role, including for the generations after. There is no, they were also free. And then the last thing that you mentioned, this is all in the Old Testament, was it matter? Well, it matters for two reasons. One, you went from this isn't slavery to trying to, it seems, explain why God regulated slavery. So it seems like you're now agreeing that slavery is allowed in the Bible. You're just putting an asterisk on it and saying that Jesus is fixing it later. And Jesus doesn't want us to follow this anymore. But if you go to Matthew 5:17 through 20, you'll see Jesus, from his own mouth, say that he did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. He came to fulfill the law, and he tells his followers to follow this law. And he says that the ones that do will be called the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and the ones that don't will be the least in the kingdom of heaven. And he says, not until heaven and earth pass away and all is accomplished, will this law be gone. And that doesn't happen until Revelation 21. Revelation 21 talks about all being accomplished and the new heaven and new earth coming. So according to Jesus' own mouth, his followers should be following these laws. This is what he said. So
Yes,
yeah,
I literally
so even Jesus wants you to follow these laws.
No, it's funny you brought that up because I was just reading that too. Of That's why I brought up the example of divorce. I brought up divorce is because he was clarifying. He had said, how Moses said that if you were to divorce someone, you should have a certificate. But he wanted to clarify that no man should divorce a woman unless it's because of sexual immorality, my bad. No. So I'm not really swapping from what I was saying. What I said in the beginning of it's not really slavery is still what I'm saying. I'm glad you brought up that word because I think a more accurate term for what they were is an indentured servant. The Hebrew term for slave is ibed, which comes from the root abed, which implies paid servanthood. I just found that a little while ago because I always knew that there was different meanings for the word. Obviously, the word grape, you know what I'm trying to say. Grape is said in the Bible, but it doesn't mean what we say grape is. So I think the more accurate term is indentured servant rather than a slave. And so I feel like you're trying to compare, chattel slavery that we've experienced in America to that being in the Bible, but the Bible is not at all showing any signs of having slavery the way we had it out in the West. And then, where was it? That a slave is given rights. We've talked about that. It was consensual, meaning that these are people that were trying to escape poverty and were seeking food and shelter, and the exception being prisoners of war. And I've already explained that prisoners of war would be kidnapping, which anyone in the Bible that kidnaps would be put to death. And then I had something I wanted to show you.
Well, the Israelites took prisoners of war, and they even made wives of some of the women of them. So captives can't consent to being your slave, nor can they consent to sex. So it seems, again, agreeing that they kidnapped people.
How did I agree to that?
Because you said that because a prisoner of war would be kidnapping people, and that would mean you'd have to be put to death. And yet the Bible allows them to take prisoners of war and then make them slaves, or even make them wives, which I would call sex slavery.
I think you're mistaking, those choices of the Israelites as being God allowing it, because that's not essentially what was happening.
No,
And
these are the rules of God. These are God's rules for their warfare.
to take prisoners of war, that's what the verse
Yes, yes.
is saying.
If you go to Deuteronomy 20 and 21, Deuteronomy 20 has the rules of warfare. God is talking to Moses and saying, these are how you tell my people to engage in battle. Now it says in verse 10, when you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace, and if it responds to you peacefully and opens its doors, then all the people who are found shall do forced labor for you and serve you. But if it makes no peace with you and makes war with you, then you shall besiege it, and the Lord God gives it and when the Lord God gives it into your hand, you shall put all its males to the sword. But the women and the little one and the livestock and everything else in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as plunder for yourselves. And you shall enjoy the spoils of your enemies, which the Lord God has given you. Thus you shall do with all the cities that are very far from you, which are not the cities of the nation here. And then it goes on to say, but the nations that are here, kill them all. Men, women, children, animals, everything. Kill them all. And then in the next chapter, 21, if you start in verse 10, it says that when you go out to war against your enemies and the Lord God gives them into your hand and you take them captive, so again, war, captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman and you desire her to be your wife, you bring her home to your house, and then she shall shave her head, pare her nails, and she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and remain in your house, and lament her father and mother for a full month. After that you may go in to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go wherever she wants, but you shall not sell her for money, nor treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. So we have two passages where God is allowing his people and saying, hey, when I give you this thing to take captive of these people, you may treat them as plunder. These are the people you kill, these are the people you don't. And then in 21, 10 through 14, it's allowing them to see among the captives a beautiful woman and lust after her, saying, hey, I want that. Take her back to their homeland and then make her a wife. And literally, if they no longer like her, they can kick her out. They can't sell her as a slave or, sell her for money, though, because he humiliated her. The Bible sees her as worthless because he did this to her. And that's two examples right there of the Hebrews, via the laws of God, being able to engage in battle and take hostages and force them to be wives, even, that they can kick out if they no longer like.
Is that in the verse, the one you were talking about, the woman being worthless? Is that in the same verse where they speak of, like, if you grape a woman, you pay her father 50 silver?
No, that's the next chapter, actually.
Okay, yeah. Because, like I said, there are misinterpretations of the word grape in that time period. It's not exactly what it's saying. It's saying, like, if you humiliate a woman and you sleep with her, you are required now to basically marry her to avoid her from shame. And if you don't, you are sinning.
Let's look at the context of this first. We can address that if you'd like, but let's look at the context of this.
Yeah.
This is a woman who was living her life. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, people showed up, surrounded her city, and said, "Be our slaves, or we're going to overtake you." Whichever way this went, her city lost. She is now a captive, and some soldier said, "You, I like you," and she is now taken to his homeland. Her hair and nails and clothes are taken from her, and according to scholars and Bible Hub and all these things, this is to symbolize her roles changing from this godless heathen and symbolizing her transference to being a godly Hebrew wife. It's a cultural change. So she's stripped of her identity and her culture and given something else. And then after 30 days, he gets to come in and make her his wife. And then if he doesn't like her, he can just kick her out.
Hmm.
So the context of this, all it shows to me is that it's allowing these men to rape the women that they take captives as prisoners of war.
Um, so that's why I, showed the other um, verses earlier. But in the case,
Sorry, you paused. I cannot hear you.
if they refuse to make peace with you and engage battle with you, so you were saying like, a woman, um, it would obviously be her husband who's a part of the city that's fighting against them. And if he refuses to make peace, then he would be slaughtered because he's engaging in battle. That's what it says. If they refuse to make peace and engage in battle. So it's not refusing to make peace and refusing slavery. It's saying no, they're engaging battle with them. They're fighting against them. So that is why God refers to as plunder, because now these guys are fighting for in pretty much self-defense, because these guys are basically given the option to leave the city, but they are engaging in battle. They are not making peace with them. So it's not supporting this. And then also, let's just say,
They're not given the option to leave the city. They're given the option to willingly become slaves or die in the process of
the
becoming
verse doesn't
slaves.
say that. The verse doesn't say that, though.
Yes, it says that all who are found within shall do forced labor for you and will serve you. What is forced labor, and what is of someone who serves you? That's a slave. All right, thank you, Dr. Joshua Bowen. If you can, I think that that'd be great, because we were talking about a bed and its original Hebrew meaning and stuff, and I think you can just explain that a little better than I can.
Okay. So the reason why is because the people are there to fight, but God calls them to make peace at first, to avoid bloodshed. And so in doing so, if they were to invite them willingly in, then they would have to basically perform duties. That's kind of like a job. Like, okay, we let you into the city, now, now we'll do jobs for you.
Then why does it say forced labor? Why is it describing that if you overtake the city, they will be serving you, and you can
Hmm.
make them do forced labor?
So just like you said, a part of the agreement, that if you break a part of the agreement, you are forced to do something. So in this, they had an agreement, they made a peace offering, and so now they are forced for labor, because now is a peace offering, because they could have came in and slaughtered everyone, but instead they're going about it a peaceful way.
How is that peaceful? How is it peaceful to go up to somebody's life and say, "Hey, you're going to be my servant now, or I'm going to kill you"?
I would have to know the context of that, which
We,
I
we, we just read the
unfortunately.
context. It says that when you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace. So this is Israel being the aggressor. Israel is going to a city to fight against it, and this is how they ought engage in their warfare. They are to offer their terms. Either you are going to willingly be our forced labor, or we are going to kill all the men and just take everything else anyway.
Yes, I understand that, but
Do you
in
agree
this,
that's the context, though?
I agree that that's part of the context
Okay,
of
what
we
what
cle
what am I missing?
So where it says, yes, if you march up against a city, but like I said, this is at the time period of um the Old Testament. People own different lands, people are at different lands. So I don't think that this is basically saying like, oh, because they're attacking the city, that immediately makes them in the bad. There could be, like I said, context to why they're attacking this city. It's not pointedly playing if you invade a city. It says if you attack a city. It's not invade.
But that's what they're doing. They're attacking the city by invading it. But the thing is, in this chapter, and you're welcome to read the entire thing for your own context. I welcome everyone to do that. Is it's not talking about a specific city. It's being very but it is being very specific with what kind of cities. If you look in verse 16, it I'm sorry, in verse 15 it says, "Thus you shall do with all the cities that are very far from you, which are not the cities of the nations here, but in the cities of the people that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may be not or that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices, as they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord, as against the Lord your God." So these are the instructions. The people that live here in the nations here, in in this listing, that's the hit list. Kill them all. Everything that's in there. Nations, kill them all. But all the nations elsewhere, everything else outside of that, these are the general rules that you are to do. If you want to go and overtake it, you
Hmm.
march up, you present your terms, and they will either agree to be your forced labor, or they will suffer the consequences of death and just being taken anyway. So, regardless, this is Israel engaging in war and being
Hmm.
allowed to take hostages and kidnap these people, take them back to Israel, and do with them as they please. So, you said that kidnapping someone, a free person, is slavery, and this is literally God allowing them to take slaves from the nations around them via war.
Mm.
But real quick, because I don't know how quickly or how much time Dr. Bowen has, but Dr. Bowen's a good scholar for this kind of stuff, and I think that he might be able to answer the Eved thing more than I can, or at least better than I can. So, Dr. Bowen, if you could.
Yeah, because you had made a claim earlier that you had said some scholars had talked to you that if you leave your slave owners, you're still in Israel, or you're still you
Yeah,
know
that's a separate issue, but we can definitely talk about that
yeah, I would
next.
like to talk about that.
But yeah, Dr. Bowen, could you just explain Abed? He Christians here is understanding that that means paid labor. It is my understanding that this is talking about someone in a service role, which could be a slave or a servant. The context would have to be needed for us to understand more.
Yeah. By the way, thank you for having me up. Um, Good to talk to you again.
Oh, thank you
I
for being here.
think, oh, of course. And if you do hear sudden screaming in the background from 4-year-old twins, that I apologize. Their mother's in the UK, so um, yeah. So in Eved, uh, it comes from Hebrews. The Hebrew language words are based off of 3-letter roots. So yeah, this one is Ayin Beit Resh, or Ayin Beit Dalet, which is uh, Eved, which is where that term comes from. The verb that's based on that root is avad, which has a more general sense, like to work, and it can it's much broader in its application. So it could be anything from like somebody going out and just doing whatever kind of work to all the way down to slave labor. However, an eved, the noun form of this, you know, it's even though there's a wide application of its uses, it's not really a paid worker. There's a separate word for that, um, and really, it's not used. It's not used in other contexts to indicate something other than a slave or like a debt slave or a chattel slave. Um, Instead, it can be used, somewhat more. Um, I don't know. It can be applied to somebody like Moses, right? Moses is the slave of Yahweh, or Joshua is the slave of Yahweh, or the servant in Isaiah, is the servant is the slave, the Eved of Yahweh. Petty kings can be slaves of their um, suzerain. right? So in during the Amarna period, you have the kings in the area of Canaan that are the Akkadian term that's used there is like sort of the cognate or the equivalent of Evet. It's a Wardu, and they're the petty king says he writes to the pharaoh and says, "I, your slave, write to you." Now, he's a slave in the sense of he's a vassal to the pharaoh, but I mean, certainly that king that's living in the palace, he's not working in somebody's field or kitchen or something. So there's polyvalency to all these terms, just like in any language. So yeah, what you said is precisely right. Like it's going to be context dependent. So the questions that I think we have to ask ourselves when we look at a term like Evid is like what else is being described about this individual in or this role in the context. So this is why when you read passages, in Exodus 21, some of the laws that are there, most scholars come down on, all right, this one seems like it's describing a debt slave, this one, or a pledge, this one seems to be describing a chattel slave. And the reason that they do that, even though they're all using the same Hebrew word eved, is because of the other, constellation of characteristics that are describing the individual in those contexts. I hope that made sense.
Hey, Christian, do you have any questions about that?
I feel like it definitely explained, what I was, having trouble with at first is just like my interpretation of it, because even I do have um misjudged certain things, but mm,
It might help. And sorry, I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought, but I wonder if this example might help. The word "run." If you just saw in the sentence "it is running," or maybe you just saw "running" in a sentence because it would kind of narrow it down some. But like if you just saw "running" in a sentence, like that alone is not going to tell you how to define that term because it could be, and running could be, indicative of a person sprinting down a track in an Olympic meet. It could be, somebody like me who's not an Olympian, jogging around the block. It could be the sink, the tap is on and water's coming out of it. It could be that the
yeah.
refrigerator, yeah. So it's
So
it's all going to be context dependent. Like what else is being described about this thing that is running?
yeah, so in that verse, when it says God, is basically saying like if you march upon a city, just hearing that alone, it just sounds like it's justifying anything. But like the when you find out why Israelites went to war, it was because they were promised the land of Canaan. They were told to take out the wickedness um, of certain people that weren't living by God, like as punishment. So there was different reasonings for why these people were invading. It doesn't sound like they were like some Vikings and just pillaging to pillage. It feels like there was more reasoning behind why these wars were going on. And then
Well,
also on top of that, it stated that where it was in the verse that you had told me, where it was like if you're laying siege to a castle or a city, you don't cut down the good trees. So it's not like these people are going in burning down everything. Like they're supposed to respect the land because this is going to become their new land. It isn't essentially just stealing everything.
well, and maybe you missed it when I read it, but in Deuteronomy 20:10 through 18, I think that kind of goes against with what you're saying, because you're saying that they were promised this land, and so when they go to war with the people of this land, they're following these rules so that they can do their best to respect the land because that's the land that they were inherited. But that's not what the passage says. The passage is saying that the nations that are in the land that was promised, kill them all, everything that breathes in them, kill them all. So they are going through and burning it down and ending everybody's lives. The people that they're supposed to engage in this kind of treaty type of thing, or not treaty, this ultimatum with, are the people outside of that. So yeah, these are the people that are not in the nations that of the land that was promised to them. This is everybody else. So it doesn't seem like God cares what the reason is that they're going to war with them. The people that are in the land that He has inherited, or that they're going to inherit, they're just supposed to kill everybody and everything. But it's everybody else, the rest of the open world, that they are supposed to engage in these things with.
I was talking about Deuteronomy 2019 or 2019, yeah, is where I was referring to of, if
Yeah, sure. I don't see what having to not chop down trees and stuff has anything to do with justifying kidnapping people from their own town or forcing them to be slaves. We're talking about slavery in the Bible and the ways that God is allowing them to take them. I don't really care about the trees. I'm sorry. But you had another question that I think we wanted Dr. Bowen for. Um, Dr. Bowen, when it comes to runaway slaves running away to or running away and getting an allotted land of property, this is more in reference to like slaves running away to Israel from outside nations, right? Because if they were part of Israel or anything in any way, when they, if they ran away somehow, they would just end up going back home, right? And also, and I could be wrong, but is there not an Old Testament story of an Israelite who heard that his slaves had run away to elsewhere and he went and got them back?
Yeah, that's right. And sorry, my son just, while you guys were talking, came over and said that he switched his diaper. So I've been any of that. Sorry, you probably don't need to know any of that, but if you hear him yapping in the background, that's why. Um, but good timing. Yeah. So one, the uh, the Deuteronomy 23:15 to 16 is, yeah, it's a passage that most scholars today would say that that work in the field would say that this is talking about, it's a lot of the stuff that's connected in the book of Deuteronomy to how to have foreign relations with other nations. So what you guys were just describing fits into that category perfectly, right? Because what's happening is, um, they're supposed to. There are two aspects to what happens with uh, the nations that they're going to encounter. The first is the people that they encounter in the land of Canaan proper, right? Their promised land. And the text is clear, not just in Deuteronomy 20, but elsewhere, that they're supposed to, eradicate those nations. Um, and as you were pointing out, the other groups, those that are far off, these are ones that they're following what is um, the standard practice of the amongst other nations, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, uh, of the first millennium BCE. This period that, uh, I'm sorry about all the crinkling in the background. I'm just trying to take care of all this stuff. Um, that's so gross. Sorry, don't need to hear any of that. Um, so the Neo-Assyrian Empire, they had what was in their text what they called the land of Asher. Asher was Assyria, the name of their deity Asher. So they had the land of Asher, and then they had the yoke of Asher. And the land of Asher was like the actual land of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, like where the main, in between the Tigris and the Euphrates River up in the north. northern Iraq, Syria area. But then the yoke of Asher was all the other city states or nations that they would go out to and conquer or create vassals out of. So when you see like Sargon marching out to the west, he's doing so coming over, to what we would consider today, like the Lebanon, Levantine region, um, making making vassals out of these people groups. And what they do is they don't conquer them in the sense of, all right, we're going to turn, here we are, uh, northern Israel, Samaria, like we're going to turn you into Assyria. Like we're going to extend Assyria all the way from, northern Iraq all the way out here. That's not what they do. Instead, what they say is like, you're under our control now. You're our vassal. So we're going to leave you here. Oftentimes they leave the ruler, the local ruler in power, but they say, you're our vassal now. Here are the terms of agreement that you're going to sign up for. You're going to pay us tribute. If we need to go to war, you're going to, we're going to come up and say, hey, give us soldiers to go fight this war with Egypt, whatever. And you're going to send your people. We got to build a building. We want to do some stuff. Like we're going to come knocking on your door and you have to supply it for us. So this is what vassals did. So what Deuteronomy is picking up on in chapter 20 there is just this, right? It's setting up, okay, you're gonna go and essentially be the new Assyrian Empire. You guys are gonna be the ones that you're gonna take out all the people that are in Canaan, that's your land, but then you're gonna march out to these cities that are far off, go knocking on the gate and say, hey, you're our vassals now, right? If you agree, if you sign our shalom treaty, right, our peace treaty, um, then you're good. You can stay in place, do your thing. But whenever we need you, whenever we want to fight, whenever we want to build something, whatever, you're going to be mas, the Hebrew word there, mas, that you guys are saying forced labor. That's what that term is. Same word that's used in Exodus to talk about what the Israelites did in Egypt. So that's the thing that's being set up there. So in that context, the runaway slave in Deuteronomy 23, if you have a vassal, and we have lots of examples of this from the ancient Near East. You have treaties, a vassal treaty, a vassal suzerain treaty. Some of the terms that you will see in those treaties are things like, if people, like if a soldier, one of our soldiers defects or like runs away and shirks his duty or whatever, and runs away. Yeah, buddy. All right, hang on just one second. And runs over to you, to the vassal. You are required to return him to us. And the same thing is true as if our slaves escape to you, you have to return them back to us. This is a common thing that happened. So, what most scholars think is happening, this is the most long winded way of ever answering a question. I'm so sorry about that. What they think is happening here in Deuteronomy 23 is that this is talking about one of these nations around Israel that has become a vassal. One of their slaves escapes into Israel. They are yes, pal. Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. Here, um, they are not to return them to their foreign master. This would be sort of akin to or indicative of a treaty that is not a vassal treaty. So you don't send slaves back to your vassals, is the point. Um, However, because in the ancient Near East, if you harbored a fugitive slave, the reason that you did that in their mind was because you wanted him, right? You wanted that slave for yourself. So that's why in the law collections it'll say things like, if somebody is found with somebody else's slave, they're not going to be able to say like, oh, I was just like, he ran away and I was just like holding him for you or something, because they're thinking you're keeping him. So what the law is also trying to be sensitive to is that notion of if a slave were to run away and you were to harbor them, you were to bring them in or something, then that would be viewed negatively. because then it's like you're trying to take them for yourself. So what the text talks about is they're basically to take a hands-off approach to a slave that escapes into their midst. Um, and they're to let him live wherever he wants to live. They're not allowed to oppress him. But they're not really supposed to come to any particular aid either. They're just supposed to kind of let them do their thing. And then the last thing I'll say, and I think you touched on it actually already, was one of the big reasons that we think, or two of them, I suppose, that we think that this is foreign slaves, and not just any slave in general, is the way the text words this is they can choose from whatever city they want to live in, right? It's kind of odd wording, odd verbiage if this were an Israelite, because they wouldn't just pick a spot. Like if an Israelite ran away because they had a bad master or something, and the law said you can't return it to a bad master, like they would just go home, right? They'd go back to their landed property or back to their kin that lived on that landed property. They wouldn't just pick a random spot. That's not how it worked. So that seems to be, problematic for an Israelite internal to the land running away, being the subject there. And the other thing that you were mentioning, and then I promise I'll shut up, is you're talking about the Shemay, and I can't remember precisely where it's at. I think it's
Yeah,
in
I
First
just found it
Kings.
actually. It's in First Kings chapter 2
There you
and
go.
39 to 41, I believe.
That's right. Yeah. So the slave runs away, and then he goes and he, or two slaves run away, right? I think in the story.
Yeah, it says that it
Yeah.
happened at the end of 3 years that two of Shemi's servants ran away to Achish, a son of Maach, king of Gath, and it was told to Shimi, "Behold, your servants are in Gath." Shimi arose and saddled a donkey and went to Gath to Achish to seek his servants, and he brought them back from Gath. And
Yeah.
then it shows that Israelites could indeed go and get their slaves back, but
Yeah. And I mean,
the
one
vice
could, like,
versa was not allowed.
an apologist could argue,
It's a
obviously, that this is, well, this
hypocrite.
is, yeah, right. This is them not obeying the law or something. Like they could make that argument if they still hold to that position. But again, as far as academia is concerned, like,
The
it,
thing that would give me pause
yeah,
for that, though, at least, was because Solomon, because he's under house arrest at the time, and Solomon is angry when he returns because he broke house arrest, not because he went to go commit a crime. You
sure,
know, so it
yeah.
seems at the very least the legal authority does not recognize that he did a crime aside from leaving his house arrest.
Yeah, the text, this isn't like a Jeremiah 34 or a Nehemiah 5 where it seems like the text is saying, hey, you're not obeying slave laws. It doesn't seem like that's the idea here. I
Yeah,
agree with you, but I don't know if that helped at all.
yeah. Christian, what are your thoughts?
So now hearing all that, and I listen to everything, and like when I say it out, you shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst in the place which he shall choose in one of your towns where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him. So what I heard, or what I kind of took it, is it was almost as if, like, scholars look at it as like the slave was trading one slavery for another. But when I hear, like, he shall live with you in your midst in the place which he shall choose, that in itself, like him choosing where he wants to live in one of the towns, doesn't seem like slavery to me.
Oh,
But
yeah, no, no, no. Sorry, to be clear, no, he's not. That they're specifically not to take him as a slave. That's kind of wrapped up in that term "ana" that you translated there is like oppressed. You should not oppress him. Yeah, no, I agree with you. They're not explicitly not supposed to take this individual as a slave. Yeah, I agree.
yeah, the last one, it says you shall not mistreat him. So definitely, like, he there is no form of punishment for him running away.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
correct.
so with the, the story of the attacking a city and stuff, that's why I was gonna bring up earlier, is like, okay, now we take this story of this woman, and her whole city was overthrown, and she had to leave. She didn't have to essentially put herself into slavery. She could have just left, because it says if they refuse to make peace and engage battle with you. Now, the time where it says forced labor is what is if they decide to what's it called, let the gates open. And then it says at the very end that, you know, you take the women, children, you know, as plunder and stuff. So right there as plunder, well, the same rules for, you know, slavery would still apply, where it's the slave can leave, and if she wants to go to another place, she can, and choose a place of her choosing. So it's still not really slavery permanently, is how I'm seeing it right now.
I'm sorry, just to be clear, we're talking about the um, Deuteronomy 21:10 to 14, with the captive bride.
Yeah, I believe that's who he's referring to. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the most reasonable interpretation of the text is that this is sort of a continuation of the general marching orders that are talked about in chapter 20 that we were talking about earlier. Um, and in that context, the text says, "If you see among the captives a very beautiful woman." So these ostensibly, given what we see in the rest of the text, where she's supposed to mourn her mother and father, that sort of thing. Um, I think the text is assuming that this is a woman that is amongst the group of captives of a city that put up a fight. So they're one of the ones that they went and offered them peace, and the city said, "No way, we're not going to become your vassals." And so they had to lay siege to them, and then emasculate the city, and then take the women and the children and the property as plunder.
And
Uh,
in that scenario, the women and children are plunder. Aren't they given the option to leave though?
no, no, they're just taken as plunder, and again, that's pretty standard in ancient Near Eastern uh, culture. This is what they did at wartime. Um, most of I think the idea that you would see here is that they're counted as property, right? So they would probably um, be taken very similarly to what we saw with the Benjaminites in the Book of Judges, being taken for wives or for slaves. And again, this isn't something that like scholars think was actually uh, something that took place historically in ancient Israel, because Israel's never really in that position of power where they can do that sort of thing. There's an idealistic sort of
So
text.
them holding the women and children, you know, that's the point though, is what I'm trying to get at, is like that's not God's commandment. That's not what he's saying, because in all these other ones, it's saying a slave can run away. You were to treat a slave the same as you would a local, like a Hebrew slave.
So there's a distinction that I think we should probably be sensitive to. In the Deuteronomy 23 passage, essentially what the text is describing is like, Christian, like you and I, let's say we're out in the field in, I don't know, the area of the land of Naphtali or something. And we see this slave come across from Moab. I don't know. And we're like, hey, that guy doesn't look like he's from around here, right? And you come to find out this guy has run away from a slave owner in Moab, right? This foreign nation. Well, like, we're not supposed to go get this guy. Let's call him Frank. We're not supposed to go grab Frank and then take him back over to Moab and be like, hey, who's this guy? Go to a local temple or something and say, hey, do we know who owns this slave? Instead, and we're also not supposed to be like, hey, Christian, check it out, man. Let's go get us a slave, right? We're not supposed to do that. What we're supposed to do is, all right, well, hey, make sure like nobody messes with that guy. Just let him do his thing, right? And ostensibly, he would be able to glean in the fields, and he would be able to do what any other poor person does, right? We're just supposed to take this hands off approach. So that is distinct, though, from what's being described in Deuteronomy 20 and 21, which this is talking about actual marching orders. So this is Israel's going out to war, or going out to battle. And if that city puts up a fight and they emasculate the city and then take the women and the children and the possessions as plunder, I may have to go here in a second because they're starting to get a little antsy. Um, But then, okay, okay, I promise I'm coming. Give me 20 seconds, okay? Um, then those individuals are captives. That's why the text refers to them as such, right? They're captives, they're plunder. And so they're being brought back. It's not that they're running away, right? They are now captured by the Israelites. They're being brought back. And now the text says, if an Israelite sees this very beautiful woman amongst the captives and says, I want to have her for my wife and have her, produce an heir for me, here's the procedure for how to do that. I'm so sorry to do this. They're going to start losing their minds. If I don't, I will try to come back up if I can get them to settle down.
No, it's
Sorry
okay.
to do this
Thank you
like
for
hit and
your
run
time
thing.
and being here at all.
No, I appreciate it, and
I think you
I'll
helped
yeah I'll
provide a
try to
lot of
come back.
insight.
No, well, good. I'm glad. All right, thanks, guys. I'll try to come back.
All right, have a good day.
Thank you, man.
See. You.
But yeah, Christian, I hope that some of this does help clear some stuff up. And if you want, the guy that was just on, he's got a couple books that go into more detail on the subject, and that names quite a few other scholars
Right.
that and their perspectives, whether they agree or not, and the basis for it. It's pretty cool. But yeah, I would agree with that we're very specifically getting marching orders in Deuteronomy 21, 20 and 21. But then we move to various laws. We're no longer talking about just in war and this situation. We're talking about various laws that it's more broad and more open now.
Appreciate it, man. My bad. I'm back. I had a customer. What?
Oh,
Can you
you're good.
repeat that last part?
I was just saying that I do agree that I would find that Deuteronomy 20 and 21 are talking about a very specific circumstance, going to war and how one engages in that from the Hebrew law perspective. And then once we hit 23, or actually not just, or once we hit the 22, we're starting to open up to more broad various laws, and it opens up to different aspects of life. We're no longer just isolating war.
Mm. So, I 100% agree that even at surface level, if you look at it, you would obviously see it as like a contradiction to God's word. If God is saying that kidnapping should be punishable by death, and then it looks like he's sanctioning kidnapping. So I have to do more research into Deuteronomy and what God is basically saying and like the context of like how they were living back then. But I really do think that, like he was saying, like an apologist could argue that God isn't sanctioning. These are people doing against God's will. The verse of that he had brought up, though, that if you see a woman that you find as beautiful or attractive, that to take her as your wife or son, I would have to do more research into that because I don't exactly mean what I don't exactly know what God meant in those verses.
Yeah, for sure. And I believe that he was really only aiming that to that one specific example in First Kings 2 with Shimei getting his slaves back. How that specific thing could be argued as these are men not obeying the law. But when God is giving the law in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, this is God's law. And this is what God is saying. So this isn't something that we could argue is just men doing what they're doing, and that's just what's being recorded. This is supposed to be recording what God is telling his nation to do and how his nation should act. So that's a little bit different,
I didn't look up or the verse though that he had said with the women that you find beautiful. But if
Yeah,
it's
that one
exactly how
is
he
in
has
first, or that's in Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14.
Deuteronomy, because if it's exactly like how he said, it definitely sounds like that was God's law.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, I don't want to look at it with surface level and concede to that because there's been plenty of verses before that I looked at surface level. It looks like a contradiction, and then the more I find out, the different translation for words, what the original translation in Hebrew was, and the context of the time period of what was going on, sometimes changes. It makes me not think it's a contradiction. Say it one more time. One Deuteronomy.
This is in Deuteronomy 21, verses
Deuteronomy
10 through 14.
10 to 13. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna look into that.
Yeah,
So
and if you're curious, I do post my lives to my YouTube. So if there's anything you wanted to go back and hear again, you can definitely do that as well. I know that we talked about a lot of different passages and verses, and sometimes they just get lost in there. But
yeah,
but yeah, I think that there's a lot that can be shown that from the legal case, or from the legal point of God giving His laws to the people, it's He's allowing, just straight up allowing slavery, but He's regulating it to that only certain people can be slaves. The rest of the people can engage in things like indentured servitude and other aspects as well, because they're two different systems. But He is allowing slavery only if they're non-Hebrews, and only through certain methods can they be taken, by purchase, by captives of war, or by them being born to your already slaves. And we see this even echoed, or we see this never fixed, because I know earlier you talked about Jesus fixing this. I don't see anywhere in the Bible where this gets fixed, because even in the New Testament, we see passages where slaves are being told to submit to their earthly masters, even the cruel ones, because God is more pleased with you suffering unjustly than He is with you suffering justly, because it echoes Jesus. There is never a time where slavery is said to be wrong, or to let your slaves go, or to only engage in buying slaves if you plan to release them. Nothing of the sort at any time from the Old Testament beginning to the end of the New Testament. So I'm not quite sure where people are getting this, that was somehow changed.
1 second. 1 second.
For sure, take your time. Yeah, these are the questions. I think that if we're going through this much study, and I encourage all the study, looking up the definitions, reading everything, trying to understand how it all works, I think that all that should be done before one aligns himself as a Christian or as a follower of this God. Because what happens, and I see this most often with what's it called, soul winning, where there's certain denominations like Baptists and stuff like that that go out and try to do some soul winning, and they're like, hey, can I tell you the gospel? Let me talk to you about Jesus. Let's get you saved today. Let's get you saved now. And something that I hear quite often of people that have experienced that is being like, wow, I've never heard the story of Jesus that way, or I had never heard it in the way that it was said to me. It was pretty convincing. I thought it sounded great. And for whatever reason, they went through and they're like, yeah, I'm going to pray the prayer and stuff like that. But then all of a sudden they're treated as if they're part of the club. And now that they're part of the club, there's all these things they got to follow. Suddenly they are understanding what it actually means to be a follower of Christ. Not that you believe that He died for you and is saving you from your sins, but now you can't go out and drink with your friends. Now maybe you can't even say certain words, watch certain movies, or listen to certain music, or even maybe seeing certain people, cutting certain people out of your life, maybe your family, even your children, or having hatred for certain groups of people. I know I would listen to this one woman who talked about how she had some IFB Baptists that quote unquote got her saved, and then the next thing she knows, they're preaching very homophobic things, to the point of talking about executing people, and it was scary for them. So I think that if someone really wants to join a religion, or sees or recognizes what they believe to be truth in a religion, that they should actually take the time to read it all and study it all and have a good understanding before they actually align themselves with that. Because then we run into issues with, well, I'm this religion, but did my God actually say that you could take women from other places as captives and make them your forced wives? Or did my God actually say, that, or did my God not actually punish a prophet who was with a child, or did my God actually curse women to be raped? These are all things that I would hope you would have taken the time to read and go through beforehand. But
Yeah. Well, since you said this post on YouTube, I guess I would want anyone that's listening to know that, I 100% do agree with you that before you do choose something, you should do research into everything. And, I was born into, my family was Christian, but they really did not force it upon me. So I was given that option and freedom to explore and look at all the things. So as I was slowly like leaning towards becoming a Christian, I did research a lot of, what people believed are contradictions in the Bible. The tough questions, like if God is all powerful, he can't be all good, those kind of things. So I don't say this question, I mean, this live and the topic, definitely like my faith did not waver at all, even with these new verses. That's why I said I just need to research more. And so, but yes, I do agree with you that people should, have full knowledge into, what they're going into. But I also don't think anybody should be, afraid to kind of, lean towards something that they feel like their heart is calling towards them, because I do believe in trusting in yourself.
no, absolutely, and I do want to clarify. I am in no way trying to make your faith waver or change it or anything like that. I'm just of the position that if you truly believe that what you're standing on is truth, then it shouldn't be afraid to answer some questions.
Agree.
And I completely respect the answer of, I'm not quite sure. I need to go and do a little more study on this. I think that that's incredibly honorable. So this is not trying to like shame you or
No,
trying to
no,
be like, oh, you got faith. Oh, well, I'm gonna knock that down. Like I'm not trying to change that for you.
no. I want to say that I appreciate this very respectable conversation, and I very much appreciate your approach onto this. And I did not get those vibes from you at all. Like in our conversation, I I mostly, just, I was in the position earlier where I barely knew anything and I wanted to argue for God. And so that's why I had waited a little bit to educate myself more. I thought I was fully ready, but obviously the most correct approach is to read the Bible, probably not even just once, but twice before I start, you know, talking about these controversial topics like, whether God sanctions slavery or not. For right now, though, like to kind of conclude, because I do got to go in a little bit, like my end point of what I believe like the Bible is doing is I think there's just like a difference between not banning a practice and like supporting it. Like I don't think the Bible doesn't ban slavery because slavery was so commonplace at the time and because of like the symbiotic relationship that was beneficial for like both parties. The master receives labor, like I said, and the servant receives food, land, money. However, it calls for good treatment of slaves and most certainly doesn't support race-based like chattel slavery that I was talking about earlier. But I think it wasn't meant to be a perfect moral code. Like it's more of like a compromise. It was a means to an end meant to like prepare Israel for the the age of Christ rather than like straight up banning slavery. God gave like guidelines on this. Doesn't mean he agreed with it, but it doesn't mean that he didn't plan to abolish it eventually.
All right,
That's
and I do gotta get going too in a few minutes, so I'll wrap up as well. I definitely can understand your perspective. I
sure.
am a little hesitant when people say like the law wasn't like meant to be the perfect moral code or whatever, when like the Bible literally calls the law of God perfect. It says it's perfect and for all time and will be worshipped for all time. And I think one of the contradictions of the Bible is that from the Old Testament perspective, this law will stand well beyond the Messiah. But Jesus, who claims to be the Messiah in the New Testament, is saying that it will eventually change when all is accomplished and heaven and earth pass away. So it seems like they're saying different things here. But the Old Testament definitely calls God's law perfect and says that it should be followed by all people for all time. And if and when it comes to things like, well, slavery was such a common practice in that time period, that's why it was regulated instead of banned. So was idolatry, so was adultery, and so were many other practices. So was eating certain things that they were common practice amongst all the cultures, and yet God had no problem saying no to lots of things. It If God doesn't want it, if God truly thinks it's wrong, He's going to say no. If He really, really wants it, He's going to say do it. And if it seems like He doesn't care about it, He's going to be more neutral. And it seems like He just doesn't care about slavery. Sometimes He uses it, and sometimes He doesn't. It's kind of like a tool for Him. He threatens His people multiple times with it. And so, because of, so I agree with you that just because you're not banning something doesn't mean that you're endorsing it. But if you are a perfect being that is trying to give the perfect law, at least according to the Bible, for this godly nation so that the rest of the world can recognize that they are somehow holy and set apart, I think something amazing would be that, yes, in this time period, there was only one nation that did not have slaves, and they thrived. How did that happen? I think that would show the glory and power and love and mercy of God way more than God just being like, well, I know everyone's doing idolatry, you can't do that. I know everyone's doing adultery, you can't do that. I know that other cultures allow men and men to be together, kill them. And all these things, but then be like, but everyone's doing slavery. I guess I gotta let you guys do slavery. That seems very inconsistent from my point of view. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. I want you to kind of see also, like, if God like really approved of it, or if He was neutral, then why is one of the greatest books in the Bible, Exodus, all about the freeing of slaves? But I get that your probably response to that would maybe be because like the Hebrews or the Israelites received special treatment over other people. But that's why I kept referring
Sure.
to that other verse that that you are supposed to treat Hebrews the same as you would strangers, foreigners, the same as you would locals.
Sure, and yeah, that would be kind of my response is that because the only one that can enslave Hebrews is God, because they are God's servants, which is why He can threaten His people with slavery again, but every human that wants to enslave an Israelite, God says no. He repeatedly says not to do that because they are His slaves. He brought them out of Egypt. So just because God decided to bring His people out of human slavery and to just be for Him, and then literally in the next verse or chapter, still in Exodus and in Leviticus, is saying, but you can have slaves, they just can't be Hebrews. That seems to be very consistent with how God is seeing this. It's this group of people cannot be enslaved, but they can enslave other people. That's consistent enough, at least from my perspective.
Well, I very much appreciate your honesty and your respect in this conversation, and I would definitely I'll give you even a follow, just so we could probably have a conversation in the future, about a different topic, obviously one that I'm more educated on. But I do appreciate you pinpointing some verses that I definitely need to study some more, and just the book in general.
Yeah, but before you go, let me ask: have you read the full Bible before?
I've read full books. I've read pretty much the whole New Testament, and I've read a good portion, like Exodus, Genesis, of the Old Testament.
Okay, all right, I got you. Yeah, I would definitely encourage you to read the whole thing if you can. So I like the Bible app because it'll read it to me. So sometimes if I want to do more of a deeper dive on a certain passage or whatever, I'll just like listen to it over and over again, and with whatever I'm doing during my day, and I think that helps me kind of absorb some new information and stuff. But I definitely encourage a lot of reading for the Old Testament, especially if you got the New Testament under your belt already, because I think a lot of making the contradictions clear or understanding some of the like moral issues that some people would have with God and the inconsistency of His quote good and just nature is reading the Old Testament. Slavery is just one of the topics, of things that people find inconsistent with God's nature. Another one that I think is very inconsistent, you can find if you want to just take the notes in 1 Samuel 12 and 16. That story is the story of King David and the aftermath of him and Bathsheba. And in chapter 12, God punishes David by killing his infant son and cursing his wives to be raped. And then in chapter 16, the wives are raped. So it's things like that when I read it, and this is God saying that He's going to cause this stuff to happen. That makes me wonder and ask questions about the consistency of the claimed nature of God being good and just and loving everybody.
Hmm. Yes, I do know which story you are referring to as well. What I was showing you too is where I was in Matthew, so that's why when you had brought up, how Jesus said that we still abide by the old law, or He didn't come to abolish it. He didn't come to abolish it, but to fulfill it.
Yeah.
That's where I feel like it's really tricky. Like even me now, like I still like I ask like my fellow Christians and my father, like, what did that mean? Like, so are we still under the Old Testament laws? Like, so it's like we're not really called to do the things that the old people in the Old Testament did, like obviously sacrificing, those kind of things. We're called to do something else, but at the same time, we're still called to follow the Ten Commandments. So it's like it almost seems like kind of cherry picking on which things we follow of the Old Testament. But
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. I have no scriptural backing that I have found or that anyone has been able to show me that there's any reason to isolate just the Ten Commandments from the rest of the 613 laws. No, not even Jesus talks about doing that, so I'm not quite sure where people exactly get that from. It seems like a big cherry picking thing, but I would think that just the very next verses answer the question. I think where people get confused is if this is a salvation issue or not, and I don't see it as a salvation issue. As far as Jesus is not saying you have to follow the law to be saved, because there's a different quote unquote way to be saved in the New Testament. But Jesus is talking about how those that are saved, that are His followers, ought to follow the law, because He
yeah,
says those that do will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and those that don't will be the least in the kingdom of heaven. So everyone's going to be in the kingdom of heaven in this situation. They're all saved.
there'll be a hierarchy.
But there's a hierarchy, and God is clearly favoring those that follow the law.
Mm. You know what? Yeah, and I know exactly what you're talking about too. Thank you for reminding me of that,
Yeah,
because
for sure.
that really does answer that question I had. All right, man. I gotta head out, but like I said, I'm gonna give you a follow, and hopefully we can have a conversation in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. My DMs are always open, so anytime you want to chat again, just let me know. And I
Yes,
hope you have a great day.
yes, sir. You as well, and I'll check out that YouTube. You have a good
Yeah,
one.
I'll send it to you when it's done. All
Bye.
right, take care. Bye. All right, guys. Thank you for being here. My iPad's about to die